Hello, everyone. You've made it as far as chapter 4 in HTML and CSS for future programmers. Now, you'll be relieved to know that you have made it through the hardest part of the material here. The HTML chapter, the last chapter I put together for you and presented to you, that was probably the hardest one. Future programmers need to know some HTML and some CSS. You don't need to know it all. I've said that several times. And I think you probably need to know more HTML than you need to know CSS. But still, you need to know a little bit. And that's what I'm trying to present to you here. So let's get started. So I want to start with a little bit of a background. Here's a question. When talking about CSS, the C in CSS is short for cascading. So CSS means cascading style sheets. CSS is short for cascading style sheets, which begs a certain question. What do you mean cascading? Because most people understand that CSS governs the appearance of a page. The shape of things, the color of things, the placement of things. And there's maybe the idea that cascading refers to some sort of animation or something really visually stunning about the web page or the web interface. But that would be incorrect. The word cascading has nothing to do with the way the page looks and has everything to do with the way the CSS language works. So it's not about how it looks, it's about how it works. When I specify a set of rules for how a piece of content should appear on a web interface, I can specify the rule at one of three levels: the external level, the internal level, or the inline level. If I specify all my rules externally, then I'll need to use an HTML link tag to reference that external resource. So my external resource would go here, and I would bring in my CSS rules from the external file or the external URL. If I choose to specify all my rules right inside of the page, that would be an internal reference, and I would use the HTML style tag, and I would put all of my CSS rules inside of the style tag. Or there may be occasions where I want to style one specific tag and I don't want to create any extra sets of rules either at the internal or external level. I do have the option of defining a CSS style inside of the tag itself. So in this case, I've used a div tag here. It could be any tag, could be a paragraph tag, could be an anchor tag, could be a span tag, could be, I can specify the style of this tag with this style attribute, and I put my CSS rules in there. So my CSS rules could go in one of three places. I can put them in an external file, I can put them in the HTML document itself inside of the style tag, that would be in the head of the document, or I can put them here as part of the attribute of a style, as part of the style attribute of a tag. So what does that mean? What's cascading have to do with it? Well, if I have the same rule specified in three places and the rules contradict each other, let's say I have a piece of text and here I say it should be red, and here I say it should be blue, and here I say it should be purple. Which one of those things wins? Well, the purple one does, because it's the most specific. The most specific rule, the rule that is closest to the tag, wins. So this is very close to the tag. It's hard to get any closer, right? This is an attribute of the tag itself. So it wins. That's right there. So the most specific rule wins. That's one thing to remember. And when the rules complement each other, let's say we say at the external level, we say that, the font of that text should be Times New Roman. And at the internal style, we say that that text should be bold. And then in the inline section, we say, and it should be red. Then the color red. Then we would say all of those rules cascade together and come up with the full or complete rule that says the text should be Times New Roman, bold, and red. So that's the idea of cascading. The browser evaluates these different layers and applies the most relevant rule to the tag in question. That's the idea of cascading. So now you know. Now you know cascading style sheets. All right, that was my public service announcement for the start of all this. Let's see if we can look at our agenda. So our agenda for chapter 4 is to do a little bit of introduction, which I've actually already started, go over some tips, introduce you to the CSS syntax and CSS selectors. I'm only going to cover 2 of them, and then how to add CSS, which I've actually kind of just did, right, in my little intro there. And then you should know what the box model is, and I want to share with you what I consider to be the 7 most useful CSS properties, and then we'll wrap up with some review questions. Let's get going. So you've seen this slide before. You now know that in any HTML file, you're likely to find 3 separate programming languages: HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Those are separate languages. They complement each other, but they each serve a distinct purpose. They have different syntax. HTML gives you structure, CSS controls presentation, and JavaScript specifies logical instructions to be carried out. So let's zoom in a little bit on CSS. The CSS language controls the presentation of the content. So things like color, font, size, spacing, and so on are governed by CSS. To do all that, we take all of those different features of a piece of content or a tag, and we break them down into things called properties. The different options for formatting the appearance of a tag are called properties. And we put all those properties together, and we call those properties combined together a style sheet. So we can specify those style sheet properties in one of 3 places: external, internal, or inline. So generally speaking, like I just said a moment ago, if 2 specifications contradict each other, the most specific specification wins, the one that's closest to the tag. So far, so good, right? So here are some tips. Because CSS lets you change just about everything about the way a page looks, you need to be aware of how that might impact your viewer, because your viewer is a human being, right? And so if you are expecting people to read the content on your page, you want to be sensitive to something called contrast. So black text on a white background is good. White text on a black background is good. But what if I had, say, dark blue on a dark green background? That would be really hard to read. Dark brown on a black background would be really hard to read. So you want to be sensitive to contrast. You also want to make sure that all of your meaning is coming from your structure, that would be the HTML, and not from your style, that would be your CSS. And I like to think of it like this: your CSS is the icing on the cake, it's not the cake, right? It's just a way to make the whole experience more attractive for most users. And to this question down here, is, well, how do I know when the contrast is good or not? I would encourage you to use some software to check for accessibility problems, and you want to check as you go. So previously, I introduced you to the Wave tool from WebAIM. So there's an organization called WebAIM. They have the Wave accessibility checker. I would encourage you to use that. And I would also encourage you, as a developer, to to learn some CSS frameworks. Now, you have to know a little bit of CSS before the frameworks make sense. So learn a little bit of CSS just without any framework or supports. And then once you feel comfortable with that, embrace a CSS framework. That would be a collection of CSS properties that have already been put together for you, a collection of style sheets that have already been put together for you, so you don't have to recreate all that on your own. And doing so has a lot of advantages. I do recommend the Bootstrap framework, although there's lots of other good ones out there. All right, let's introduce you to the CSS syntax. So here it is. This is not tricky. This is not tricky. The color coding here is the red and the blue is strictly for the sake of presentation here. It's the way it shows up in my Visual Studio Code editor. If yours is black and white, it's still fine. So the CSS, the most basic CSS syntax looks like this. You've got this thing on the left, that's called a property, and then you've got a colon, and then you've got the thing on the right, that's the value. And that's pretty much it. Doesn't really matter if there's a space here or not, okay? Property, colon, value, and that's it. Great. Of course, looking at this, you should quickly determine that the challenge is knowing what all the properties are and what all the possible values are, right? And that is where CSS becomes complicated. There are lots and lots and lots of properties, and every property has a subset of possible values. So there's a lot to know there, and most of it is the sort of thing you want to look up when you need it. So what I'm introducing you to here is kind of the most basic properties that I can imagine, so that you have some sort of framework mentally for looking up what you need in the future. Now, suppose I wanted to apply two properties to a tag. Well, I would specify the first property and value, and then I would add a semicolon, and I would specify the second property and value. And then these two would, of course, go together. This would all be one kind of rule, if you will, and I could apply that to the style of a tag. I know I just got done saying this, but I'll say it again. There are over 500 CSS properties, and you don't need to know them all, okay? So I'm going to share with you my 7 favorites, and hopefully that gives you everything you need to kind of begin your journey, so to speak. If I wanted to group these two rules together, I would put a pair of curly braces around them. Now, I would never just do that like it is here. I would always group them together, and then I would stick something in front of that grouping. This thing here, hashtag my tag, is called a selector. There's a couple different, you have multiple choices there for selector. I believe there's over 60 different possible conventions for using a selector. Don't worry, I think you only really need 2 to really get started. So there's your selector right there. There you go. There are over 60 CSS selectors, and you can go a long way if you only know 2 of them. So I'll share with you the 2 that I think are the most common. Just a quick sidebar here. If you have been working with technology for a while, some of this syntax might remind you of something called JSON. JSON uses these things called curly brackets, these things right here. And JSON also has the notion of key value pairs, but after that, the similarities end. So JSON and CSS look similar, but they're really very different. CSS is a language, JSON is a data format, and their purposes are wildly different. CSS is older. CSS predates the creation of JSON by at least 5 years. So maybe the creators of JSON saw this convention and adopted some of those patterns. But if you're trying to connect those two dots in your mind, stop it. They're not connecting. They don't connect. Okay, CSS is very, very different from JSON. Okay, so I mentioned that you had this thing called a selector. So a selector must start with a hashtag to reference a tag by its ID attribute. So in a prior slide, I had hashtag my tag. Let's see how that works. So I have here a CSS rule that references some tag with an ID of foo. So that would mean down in the HTML section of my document, I would have a tag with an ID of foo. And of course, it could be a span tag or an anchor tag or a div tag or a paragraph tag or any other kind of tag. The idea is that this connects to this. And the hashtag is the symbol that says, oh, this is an ID. Notice that there is no hashtag here. So these two connect. And when they connect, the end result is the word hello colored in red. So I applied this CSS property or properties, I could have many of them in here, to this tag. If I want to select a bunch of things, then I would use a class. So again, I do the same sort of thing, only this time, instead of a hashtag here, I use a dot. And the dot says that the tag in question will have a class. And we will do the same thing again. And we will see that the class of foo applied to this tag results in the same effect, which again, for a beginner might lead you to question, well, why use IDs at all? Well, sometimes there's a desire to style one specific thing and not be able, don't apply that style to anything else. So a class is used to style a group of things, and an ID is used to style one specific thing. So let's take a look. Over here, we have the class of patriotic, and we're using the class equals patriotic 1, 2, 3 times down here in the body of the HTML. Here, I have the ID color1, and it styles one thing, just this ID. And you can see that these two styles work together so that when all of this gets interpreted by the browser, I have the patriotic styling, which was to make the font style italic, apply all that to red, blue, and white, but only this item here, color 1, gets the color red. And you can see that the two style rules worked together to give me red italicized text, but only for color 1. So we use a class to style a group of things. We use an ID to style one specific thing. And I had this earlier in the video. There's several different ways that you can add CSS. You can add CSS from bring it in from an external style sheet. You can specify it internal to the HTML file, or you can specify it inline. And in a moment, I'm going to show you all three of those things. Before I do all that, I want to share with you something a little bit about the box model. So the box model is really central to how content is styled in CSS, and you'll hear people talk about it. So if you're in any sort of web design environment, so the box model simply says every piece of content on your page, and we're going to use text in this case, has a box around it. Whether the box border here, whether it's visible or not, the box is still there. Now, to really understand the box model, it helps to have two pieces of content, because the box model involves us recognizing that there's gap here between the content and the border. And there's also a gap here between one piece of content and the other piece of content, or one box and the other box. So we call the space in here, we call this padding. And I always think of like foam peanuts in a box, right? You're moving from one house to another, one apartment to another. You put all your stuff in a box and you put foam peanuts around your content. The distance between boxes has a less intuitive name. It's called margin. So padding and margin. And then there's a third thing that you can specify, and that would be the border itself. So often the border is 0 and invisible, but sometimes you do want to put a box around a piece of content, and you want that border to be visible. So that's the third piece in the box model: padding, margin, and border. When I'm specifying the size of those things, I will use I need to use some sort of unit of measure. I just can't say padding 5. I have to say 5 what? So 5 px, which is short for pixels. I could say 5 pixels. I could use a percentage there, or I could use a unit of measure called an m. An m is the size of one character in the default browser's context. So 1M is about 16 pixels. So that gives you an idea of what those sizes are. Pixels are really tiny. An M is roughly one character, and a percentage is a percentage of the containing div. I know that's confusing. I would start with pixels and then move on to relative units of measure, percentage signs, and M's pretty quickly. So now we're on to the 7 most useful properties, in my humble opinion. I feel like if you can change the background color of a tag, the color of a piece of text, the width, margin, and padding of a tag, and you can specify the font family and font size of text, you can do those things that you can use those skills to grow in any direction you need to grow in. So I'm going to pause the recording here, and I'm going to jump over to a demo, and we're going to try these 7 properties out, and then we'll come back to some review questions, and that'll be the end of this chapter. All right, so I'm going to pause the recording here and get ready to work in Visual Studio Code.